The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a credit card offer and a grocery store circular. It was the kind of official-looking correspondence that immediately sets off alarm bells, the type with a return address printed in that crisp, corporate font that suggests someone means business. The return address read, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, in bold letters, followed by a P.O. box number that seemed deliberately impersonal. The envelope was thick, heavier than a typical piece of mail, suggesting multiple pages of documentation inside. There was something almost aggressive about the way it sat in the mailbox, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored among the mundane daily deliveries. Opening the envelope revealed a 3-page letter printed on expensive letterhead, the kind with a watermark visible when held up to the light. The HOA logo sat prominently at the top, a pretentious design featuring a fountain and some generic architectural elements meant to convey affluence and authority. The letter was dated just 2 days prior, suggesting whoever sent it wanted a quick response, wanted to catch the recipient off guard before they had time to properly consider their options. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Patricia Whitmore, identified as the HOA president, with her title printed in bold beneath a flowing signature that looked practiced, almost theatrical in its loops and flourishes. The content of the letter was shocking in its audacity. It began with a cold, formal greeting that immediately established a tone of superiority, as if Patricia Whitmore was writing from a position of unquestionable authority to someone who had somehow violated sacred rules they should have known about. The first paragraph stated, in no uncertain terms, that the property located at 1247 Oakwood Drive, which had been purchased just 8 months earlier, included a half-acre section along the eastern boundary that was actually designated as community land. The letter claimed this land had always been part of the community green space, maintained and used by the HOA for various neighborhood activities, and that the previous owner had simply failed to disclose this arrangement during the sale. The allegations continued with increasing boldness. The letter stated that recent surveying work commissioned by the HOA had confirmed that this eastern section, which currently included a small garden area, a storage shed, and several mature trees, was technically within the community space boundaries. According to Patricia Whitmore's letter, the HOA had discovered old documentation proving that when the neighborhood was originally developed in 1987, this particular parcel had been set aside for community use. The letter claimed that subsequent property transfers had somehow muddled the records, but that the HOA had now uncovered the true ownership status and was hereby reclaiming the land on behalf of the community. The most galling part of the letter came in the third paragraph, where Patricia Whitmore outlined the HOA expectations going forward. The letter demanded that all personal belongings be removed from the disputed section within 30 days. This included the garden shed, which would need to be demolished or relocated at the homeowner's expense. The raised garden beds, carefully constructed over the spring and summer months, would need to be removed. The small grape arbor, the composting area, even the decorative stones lining the pathway, all of it had to go. The letter stated that once the area was cleared, the HOA would install a split rail fence to clearly delineate the community space from the private property, and that any future encroachment would result in fines and potential legal action. But the letter didn't stop there. In a move that seemed designed to add insult to injury, it also included a bill. The HOA was charging for the surveying work they had commissioned, claiming that since the survey had revealed unauthorized use of community land, the cost of that survey should be borne by the person who had been improperly using the space. The invoice, attached as a separate page, totaled nearly $3,000. There was also mention of potential back fees for the unauthorized use of community land over the past 8 months, though the letter graciously noted that the HOA board would consider waiving these fees if there was full cooperation with the land clearance demands. Reading through the letter a second time did nothing to reduce the sense of outrage and disbelief it provoked. Every word seemed calculated to intimidate, to overwhelm with official, sounding language and confident assertions that left little room for questioning or pushback. The letter referenced specific HOA bylaws by section number, cited supposed legal precedents, and used phrases like pursuant to community covenants, and in accordance with established property boundaries, that gave it an air of legal authority. It was the kind of document designed to make an average person feel small, uncertain, legally outmatched before they even began to fight back. The property in question had been purchased the previous autumn after months of searching for the perfect place. The house itself was a modest 3-bedroom ranch, nothing fancy but solid and well maintained, with good bones and plenty of potential. But what had really sold the property was the land. Unlike many of the cramped lots in Meadowbrook Estates, where houses were packed together with barely enough space for a deck and a grill, this property sat on just over an acre. The eastern section, the part now being claimed by the HOA, was what had made the property special. It offered privacy, a buffer from the neighbors, room to garden and pursue projects without feeling like every outdoor activity was being observed and judged by people on all sides. During the purchasing process, everything had seemed straightforward. The title search had come back clean, with no liens, no easements, no red flags of any kind. The title insurance policy had been issued without hesitation. The closing had been smooth, almost boring in its lack of drama. The seller, an elderly woman named Dorothy Chen, who was moving to be closer to her daughter in Arizona, had been pleasant and forthcoming about everything related to the property. She had provided detailed information about the septic system, the well water, the quirks of the heating system, even which contractors she trusted for various repairs. At no point had she mentioned anything about community land or HOA claims or boundary disputes. In fact, Dorothy Chen had specifically mentioned how much she loved the privacy provided by that eastern section of the property. She had planted many of the mature trees there herself, back in the early 90s when she and her late husband had first moved in. She had talked about how she used to sit under the big oak tree on summer evenings, reading and watching the sun set through the branches. She had pointed out the spot where she used to have a much larger garden before her arthritis made the maintenance too difficult. There had been absolutely no indication that any of this land was in dispute or subject to HOA control. The HOA itself had seemed relatively benign during the home buying process. Unlike some horror stories heard from friends who lived in communities with aggressive homeowners associations that dictated everything from mailbox colors to approved holiday decorations, Meadowbrook Estates HOA had appeared low-key. The dues were reasonable, just $50 per month. The covenant seemed focused mainly on preventing truly egregious property maintenance issues, things like abandoned vehicles on blocks in front yards or letting grass grow 3 feet high. There was nothing in the documentation reviewed before purchase that suggested the HOA was the type to engage in property grabs or manufactured disputes. But now, holding this letter, it became clear that something had changed. A quick check of the neighborhood Facebook group, something rarely visited except to stay vaguely informed about community events, revealed that Patricia Whitmore had been elected HOA president just 4 months earlier. Prior to her election, the HOA had been run by a retired engineer named Bob Hartley, who by all accounts had viewed the position as a minor civic duty requiring minimal intervention in people's lives. Bob had apparently stepped down after his wife's health declined, needing to focus his attention on her care rather than neighborhood minutiae. Patricia Whitmore's online presence told a concerning story. Her Facebook profile was filled with posts about property values and community standards. She had strong opinions about appropriate landscaping, frequently sharing articles about maintaining curb appeal and the importance of uniform neighborhood aesthetics. She posted regularly in the Meadowbrook Estates group, often critiquing homes she felt weren't meeting community standards, though always couching her criticism in language about protecting everyone's investment. Several of her posts referenced the need for the HOA to be more assertive in enforcing rules and reclaiming control over community spaces, that had been allowed to fall into disarray or private use. One post from just 6 weeks earlier was particularly revealing. Patricia had shared a photo of the eastern section of 1,247 Oakwood Drive, taken from the street, showing the garden shed and vegetable beds. Her caption read, "Interesting to see private structures on what was originally designated as community green space. Makes you wonder what else we've lost track of over the years. Time for a comprehensive review of our community land boundaries." The post had received a handful of likes and a few comments, mostly from the same 3 or 4 people who seemed to support Patricia's every pronouncement. But there were also several comments pointing out that the land appeared to be private property, with one neighbor specifically noting that Dorothy Chen had maintained that garden for years without any issues. Patricia's response to those comments was telling. She had replied with a lengthy explanation about how just because something had been done a certain way for years didn't make it correct, and that the HOA had a responsibility to properly identify and manage community assets regardless of how long they might have been improperly used. She referenced the need to consult original development plans and conduct proper surveys rather than relying on assumptions or informal arrangements that previous boards might have allowed to slide. Her tone was that of someone who saw herself as bringing necessary order to a situation that had been mismanaged for too long. Going through Patricia's social media presence revealed an interesting pattern. She had moved to Meadowbrook Estates just 18 months earlier, making her one of the newer residents in a neighborhood where many people had lived for decades. Her previous posts from her old neighborhood showed similar concerns about property standards and community rules, including several complaints about neighbors she felt weren't maintaining their properties appropriately. There were posts about disputes over tree trimming, complaints about parked vehicles, grievances about noise from neighboring children. She had served on her previous HOA board as well, a detail she mentioned frequently, positioning herself as someone with expertise in community management. What became increasingly clear from reviewing Patricia's online footprint was that she wasn't someone who had stumbled into HOA leadership reluctantly or who viewed it as a minor volunteer position. She approached it with the zeal of someone on a mission, someone who genuinely believed that strong HOA enforcement was essential for maintaining property values and community standards. Her posts frequently referenced legal concepts, cited HOA bylaws, discussed property rights in ways that suggested she had spent considerable time researching these topics, even if she had no formal legal training. She was, in short, exactly the type of person who could convince herself that claiming someone else's land was not only legally justified, but morally necessary for the good of the community. The realization of who was behind this land claim made the situation both more understandable and more concerning. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or an honest mistake that could be cleared up with a friendly conversation. This was a coordinated effort by someone who had convinced herself, and apparently at least some portion of the HOA board, that she was in the right. Patricia Whitmore wasn't going to back down just because someone showed her their deed or pointed to their title insurance. She had clearly invested time and effort into building a case, commissioning surveys, researching old development documents, positioning herself as the defender of community interests against private encroachment. The immediate question was how to respond. The letter demanded a reply within 15 days, threatening escalating action if there was no response or if the response was deemed unsatisfactory. Simply ignoring it wasn't an option, as that would likely be portrayed as admission or at minimum an unwillingness to engage in good faith. But responding without proper preparation and documentation could be equally dangerous, potentially saying something that could be misconstrued or used against the property owner later in what was clearly going to become a legal dispute. The first step was to gather documentation. Closing documents from the property purchase were stored in a file cabinet in the home office. A thick stack of papers that had been signed in what felt like an endless parade of initials and signatures on that cold November afternoon at the title company. Pulling out the file revealed the deed, recorded with the county and showing clear ownership of the entire parcel, including the disputed eastern section. The property description was technical, full of metes and bounds language that referenced survey markers and distances, but it clearly encompassed the full acre, plus that the property sat on. More importantly, the title insurance policy was there, a document that had cost several $100s but had seemed like a standard part of the closing process. Something everyone got without thinking much about it. Reading through the policy now with fresh eyes revealed its significance. The title insurance explicitly guaranteed that the title was clear, that the property description was accurate, that there were no undisclosed easements or encumbrances. If someone challenged the boundaries of the property, if there really was some ancient community claim that had been missed during the title search, the title insurance company would be on the hook to defend against that claim and make the property owner whole. The title company that had handled the closing was Prestige Title Services, a regional company with a solid reputation and offices in several counties. Their business card was still paper, clipped to the inside of the closing file, showing contact information for the title agent who had handled the transaction, a woman named Rebecca Martinez who had been professional and thorough throughout the process. Reaching out to Rebecca seemed like the logical next step, both to inform her of the HOA claim and to understand what protections the title insurance actually provided in this situation. But before making that call, it seemed wise to do some independent research into the property's history. County Assessor's Office maintained records online, accessible to anyone willing to navigate their somewhat dated website. Searching for 1,247 Oakwood Drive pulled up the current assessment information, showing the property boundaries matching exactly what was on the deed. The parcel map clearly included the disputed eastern section as part of the private property, with no indication of any community ownership or easements. The assessment had been consistent over the years, showing the full acreage being taxed as private property, generating revenue for the county based on that full parcel size. Going back through historical records available online showed a clear chain of ownership. Dorothy Chen and her late husband had purchased the property in 1991 from the original owner, a man named James Fletcher, who had bought directly from the developer when the house was built in 1987. Each transfer showed the same property boundaries, the same full acreage, no mentions of community land or divided ownership. The tax records showed that every owner had paid property taxes on the full parcel, suggesting that the county had always recognized the entire acre, plus as private property subject to taxation. The county also maintained some records related to the original subdivision development. Meadowbrook Estates had been developed by a company called Greenfield Development Corporation in the mid-1980s, part of a wave of suburban growth that had transformed what had been farmland into residential neighborhoods. The original plat map for the subdivision was available as a scanned document, showing how the developer had divided the land into individual lots. Looking at this map carefully, it was clear that 1,247 Oakwood Drive had always been shown as a single large lot, with boundaries that matched the current deed description. There were indeed some parcels designated as common areas, small green spaces scattered through the neighborhood intended for community use, but the eastern section of 1,247 Oakwood Drive was not among them. This documentation seemed to directly contradict the HOA claims. If the land had always been intended as community space, if there was some original designation that had been lost or obscured over time, it should show up in these official county records. But instead, every official document painted the same picture. This was and had always been private property, properly taxed and transferred through the years without any complications or disputes. The question then became what the HOA was basing their claim on, what documents or surveys they believed gave them the right to claim someone else's land. The letter had mentioned surveying work, suggesting the HOA had hired someone to conduct a formal boundary survey. But whose survey were they using and what had it actually shown? There are different types of surveys with different levels of accuracy and different purposes. A simple sketch survey might show rough boundaries based on fence lines and visible markers, but wouldn't have legal weight in a property dispute. A full boundary survey conducted by a licensed surveyor and recorded with the county would be much more authoritative, but would also require following specific protocols and would typically be shared with affected property owners. If the HOA had conducted a legitimate boundary survey of community land that somehow overlapped with private property, there should be documentation of that survey on file with the county. A call to the county surveyor's office revealed that no new surveys had been recorded for any parcels in Meadowbrook Estates in the past year. This suggested that whatever surveying work the HOA had done, it either hadn't been completed yet, or hadn't been done to a standard that would allow it to be officially recorded. Either way, it raised serious questions about the basis for their claims and whether they were truly on solid ground or were engaging in a form of sophisticated bluffing. The situation was becoming clearer. Patricia Whitmore, relatively new to the neighborhood but armed with enthusiasm and a sense of mission about HOA governance, had apparently decided that certain lands should be designated as community space. Rather than accepting the existing property boundaries that had been in place for decades, she had chosen to commission some form of survey or boundary review, possibly based on her interpretation of old development documents or community plans. Armed with whatever documentation she had gathered, she was now attempting to pressure a relatively new homeowner into surrendering a significant portion of their property, betting that the intimidation factor of official letters and legal-sounding language would be enough to force compliance. But this wasn't a case where the facts were ambiguous or where there was genuine uncertainty about property boundaries. This was a case where decades of clear documentation, consistent county records, and proper title insurance all pointed in one direction. The question wasn't whether the land was actually community property. It clearly wasn't. The question was how aggressively Patricia Whitmore was willing to push her claims despite the lack of legitimate basis for those claims, and what it would take to definitively shut down this attempted land grab before it escalated further. The deadline for responding to the HOA letter was now 12 days away. The letter had made clear that silence would be interpreted as non-compliance, likely triggering whatever next steps the HOA had planned, possibly including fines or even attempts to physically enter the property to remove structures. Responding required striking a careful balance, firm enough to make clear that these claims were not going to be accepted without challenge, but measured enough not to escalate unnecessarily or provide ammunition that could be used in future disputes. Most importantly, the response needed to put the HOA on notice that this was not someone who could be easily intimidated, and that any further action would be met with full legal resistance backed by title insurance and proper documentation. Tomorrow would bring a call to Rebecca Martinez at Prestige Title Services, a conversation that would hopefully clarify exactly what protections the title insurance provided and what steps the title company would take to defend against the HOA's spurious claims. But tonight, sitting at the kitchen table with the HOA letter spread out alongside all the accumulated documentation proving clear ownership, the path forward was beginning to crystallize. This wasn't going to be a matter of hoping the problem would go away or trying to negotiate some compromise that acknowledged the HOA claims as having any merit whatsoever. This was going to require drawing a hard line and being prepared to back up that line with every legal tool available. Patricia Whitmore had made a serious miscalculation in targeting this particular property owner, someone who valued the land in question not just as an asset, but as the reason for purchasing the property in the first place. The fight she was picking was one she was going to regret starting. The morning started with a sense of purpose that had been absent the previous evening when shock and outrage had dominated. There was something clarifying about a full night's sleep and the simple act of organizing all the documentation into a coherent file. The HOA letter sat on top of the stack, no longer intimidating but instead serving as a reminder of just how overconfident Patricia Whitmore had been in making claims that couldn't possibly withstand scrutiny. The deed, the title insurance policy, the county records, the original plat maps, all of it told the same consistent story. This wasn't a complicated property dispute with murky boundaries and conflicting historical claims. This was a straightforward case of someone trying to claim land that clearly belonged to someone else, banking on intimidation and official-sounding letters to achieve what couldn't be achieved through legitimate means. Rebecca Martinez answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that professional warmth that good title agents cultivate, the ability to sound both competent and approachable simultaneously. She remembered the closing at 1247 Oakwood Drive without needing to pull the file, commenting on how straightforward the transaction had been and asking how everything was going with the property. The question provided a natural opening to explain the situation, and as the details of the HOA letter were laid out, the tone of the conversation shifted noticeably. Friendly small talk disappeared, replaced by the focused attention of a professional recognizing that something serious was happening within her area of expertise. Rebecca asked for the letter to be scanned and emailed immediately so she could review the specific claims being made. While waiting for the document to come through, she pulled up the file from the closing and began reviewing the title work that had been done. She explained that title insurance existed precisely for situations like this, where someone challenged the ownership or boundaries of a property after the sale had closed. The policy didn't just provide financial protection if a claim turned out to be valid. It also obligated the title company to actively defend against invalid claims, to push back against attempts to cloud the title or create uncertainty about property boundaries. The email went through, and there was a pause while Rebecca read through Patricia Whitmore's letter. Even over the phone, it was possible to sense her reaction shifting from professional concern to something closer to disbelief. She read certain passages aloud, her voice taking on an edge that suggested she was genuinely offended by what the HOA was attempting. The claim about discovering old documentation proving community ownership, the demand to remove structures and clear the land, the bill for surveying work, the threat of fines and legal action, all of it struck her as not just wrong, but brazenly so. She had seen property disputes before, boundary disagreements where there was genuine ambiguity about fence lines or easements, but this was different. This was someone making claims that flew in the face of recorded documentation and established ownership. Rebecca explained that she needed to escalate this immediately to the title insurance underwriter and to the company's legal department. This wasn't something that could be handled with a simple phone call or a standard form letter. The HOA claims, even if completely baseless, represented a cloud on the title, a challenge to the ownership that had been guaranteed by the title insurance policy. The title company had a legal obligation to address this challenge, to defend the policyholder's ownership rights, and to ensure that the property boundaries remained clear and uncontested. She promised that someone from the legal department would be in touch within 24 hours, and that in the meantime, the property owner should not respond to the HOA letter independently. Any response needed to be coordinated with the title company's attorneys to ensure that nothing was said or done that could inadvertently compromise the legal position. The conversation ended with Rebecca reiterating that this was being taken seriously, that the title company had both a contractual and professional obligation to shut down these spurious claims, and that there was no scenario where the property owner would end up losing any portion of legitimately owned land. Her confidence was reassuring, the voice of someone who had dealt with property challenges before and understood both the law and the practical realities of how these disputes typically played out. She also mentioned, almost as an aside, that if the HOA claims were as baseless as they appeared, there could be consequences for making fraudulent property claims, that this wasn't the kind of thing people could do without potential legal liability if they were knowingly making false statements. The next 24 4 hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. There was work to focus on, daily responsibilities that didn't pause just because a property dispute was unfolding. But concentration was difficult when part of the mind was constantly cycling back to the situation, imagining various scenarios and outcomes, wondering what the title company attorneys would say and what actions they would recommend. The eastern section of the property, which had always been a source of satisfaction and peace, now felt different when looking at it through the windows. The garden beds, the shed, the trees, all of it had become contested territory in a way that changed how it felt to even look at the space. The email from the title company arrived late the following afternoon, coming from an attorney named David Brennan, who identified himself as senior counsel for Prestige Title Services. The email was professional but carried an undercurrent of controlled anger, the measured response of someone who was very good at maintaining composure, even when dealing with something outrageous. David explained that he had reviewed all the documentation, including the HOA letter, the original title work, the county records, and the recorded deed. His assessment was unequivocal. The HOA claims had no legal basis whatsoever, and their attempt to assert ownership over clearly private property constituted a fraudulent cloud on the title that the title company would aggressively defend against. The email laid out several key points that formed the foundation of the legal response. First, the property boundaries were clearly established in the recorded deed and had been consistently recognized by the county for nearly 40 years. Every property tax assessment, every transfer of ownership, every official county record showed the same boundaries, including the disputed eastern section as private property. Second, the title search conducted before the closing had been comprehensive, examining not just recent records, but going back to the original subdivision development. At no point had any community ownership or easement been identified. Third, the title insurance policy explicitly guaranteed clear ownership of the full parcel as described, meaning the title company was obligated to defend those boundaries against any challenge. David's email went on to address the specific claims made in the HOA letter. The reference to discovering old documentation proving community ownership was vague and unsupported. If such documentation existed, it should have been recorded with the county and would have appeared in the title search. The fact that no such records existed in the official county files strongly suggested that the HOA's supposed documentation was either being misinterpreted, was not actually what they claimed it was, or quite possibly didn't exist at all. The mention of surveying work was similarly problematic. A legitimate boundary survey would need to be conducted by a licensed surveyor, would need to reference actual survey markers and recorded property descriptions, and would need to be consistent with the official county records. The fact that no such survey had been recorded suggested the HOA surveying work was likely a preliminary sketch or an informal assessment that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. The email also addressed the financial demands made by the HOA. The bill for surveying work was not a legitimate charge that could be imposed on a property owner who had done nothing wrong and was simply exercising rights to use their own land. The threat of back fees for unauthorized use of community land was similarly baseless, as there had been no unauthorized use, only legitimate use of private property. David made it clear that not only would none of these charges be paid, but that the attempt to impose them could potentially be viewed as a form of harassment or attempted extortion, especially given that the underlying property claims were fraudulent. What came next in the email was particularly satisfying to read. David explained that he would be drafting a formal legal response to the HOA on behalf of the title company, a letter that would make clear the title company's position and would put the HOA on notice of the serious legal consequences they could face if they continued to pursue these baseless claims. The letter would demand that the HOA immediately retract their claims in writing, acknowledge that the disputed section was private property, and cease any further attempts to assert control over the land. It would also put them on notice that any continued harassment, any attempt to impose fines, any effort to physically access the property to remove structures, would be met with immediate legal action, including potential claims for damages. David requested permission to proceed with this aggressive response, noting that it was the title company's standard practice to defend vigorously against challenges to insured titles. He also mentioned that depending on how the HOA responded, there might be grounds for additional action, potentially including filing a quiet title action to obtain a court order definitively establishing the property boundaries and shutting down any future attempts to contest them. He emphasized that all costs associated with this defense would be covered by the title insurance, that this was exactly what title insurance was designed to do, and that the property owner should feel confident that proper legal representation was now in place to handle the situation. The relief that came from reading David's email was profound. This was no longer a matter of facing down the HOA alone, of trying to figure out how to respond to legal, sounding threats without proper expertise or resources. The title company, with its team of attorneys and its financial backing and its professional reputation on the line, was now fully engaged in defending the property. Patricia Whitmore and her HOA board might have thought they were dealing with an isolated homeowner who could be intimidated into surrendering land, but they had instead triggered a response from a company that had both the resources and the motivation to fight back hard. Permission to proceed was granted immediately, and David promised that the response letter would be drafted and sent within 48 hours. He explained that it would be sent via certified mail to ensure proof of delivery, and that copies would be sent to every member of the HOA board, not just Patricia Whitmore. This was a deliberate strategy, ensuring that board members who might not fully understand what Patricia was doing in the HOA name would be put on notice of the legal jeopardy they were being exposed to. There was a real possibility that once the full board understood the situation, once they saw an actual attorney's letter explaining the fraudulent nature of the property claims and the potential legal consequences, some of them might push back against Patricia's aggressive tactics. While waiting for the title company's response to be finalized, it seemed worth doing some additional research into Patricia Whitmore's background and motivations. A deeper dive into public records revealed some interesting information. Patricia's house in Meadowbrook Estates was a modest 3-bedroom similar to many in the neighborhood, located on a standard suburban lot with minimal yard space. Her previous residence in a different town about 20 miles away had been similar in size but also on a small lot. There was a pattern suggesting someone who perhaps felt constrained by limited outdoor space and who might view larger lots like 1,247 Oak would drive with a mixture of envy and resentment. More telling were some posts from Patricia's social media that had been missed in the initial review. Several months before she had been elected HOA president, she had posted in the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook group, suggesting that the neighborhood should consider converting some of the larger private lots into community spaces. Her argument was that in a community setting, it was unfair for some residents to have substantially more land than others, and that shared green spaces benefited everyone by providing communal areas for gatherings and activities. The post had not been well received, with multiple neighbors pointing out that people had purchased their properties based on lot size, and that attempting to take private land for community use was not how property rights worked. Patricia had responded to that criticism defensively, arguing that people were being selfish and short-sighted, that prioritizing individual property over community benefit was exactly what led to fragmented, unfriendly neighborhoods where no one knew each other. She had referenced neighborhoods she had visited in other states where community green spaces were prioritized over large private lots, where people gathered regularly for block parties and community events in shared spaces. Her vision was clearly one where the neighborhood functioned more as a collective, with less emphasis on individual property rights and more emphasis on shared community resources. It was an idealistic vision in some ways, but one that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of private property rights and the legal impossibility of simply reassigning private land to community use, because it seemed like a better arrangement. What became clear from reviewing this history was that Patricia's claim about 1,247 Oakwood Drive wasn't an isolated incident or a good faith misunderstanding of property boundaries. This was part of a broader philosophy about how she thought the neighborhood should be organized, and she was using her position as HOA president to try to implement that vision, even when it conflicted with basic property law. The claim that the eastern section of the property was community land wasn't based on legitimate documentation or historical records. It was based on Patricia's belief that it should be community land, that the neighborhood would be better if that space was shared rather than private, and she had apparently convinced herself that she could manufacture a legal justification for claims that served her preferred vision. This realization made the situation more concerning in some ways. If Patricia had simply made an honest mistake, if she had genuinely believed based on some misread document that there was a legitimate property dispute, then a strong legal response from the title company would likely be enough to end the matter. She would realize her error, the HOA would back down, and life would return to normal. But if Patricia was ideologically committed to the idea that this land should be community property, if she had invested her identity as HOA president in pursuing this claim, then she might not back down even when presented with clear evidence that she was wrong. She might double down, convince herself that the title company was engaged in legal bullying, position herself as fighting for the community against powerful corporate interests. The title company's response letter arrived via email for review before being formally sent. It was 8 pages of dense legal text, and reading through it was an education in how property law attorneys deal with baseless claims. The letter opened by identifying David Brennan as counsel for the property owner and noting that the title company had a contractual obligation to defend the insured title. It then systematically dismantled every claim made in the HOA original letter, point by point, with citations to recorded documents, county records, and applicable property law. The section addressing the HOA claim about community ownership was particularly thorough. David's letter noted that the recorded deed clearly established ownership of the entire parcel, including the disputed section, that this deed had been properly recorded with the county and was a matter of public record, and that the chain of title going back to the original development showed consistent private ownership with no community interests. The letter then addressed the HOA vague reference to discovering old documentation, pointing out that no such documentation appeared in county records, that any legitimate claim to property ownership would need to be recorded to be valid against subsequent purchasers, and that the failure to record such documentation meant it could not override the clearly established recorded title. The letter demanded that the HOA provide copies of whatever documentation they claimed proved community ownership. It gave them a deadline of 10 business days to produce this documentation, and made clear that the failure to produce legitimate supporting documents would be taken as evidence that the HOA claims were made in bad faith. This was a clever legal move, forcing the HOA to either produce documentation that almost certainly didn't exist or couldn't support their claims, or admit that they had made serious legal accusations without proper foundation. Either way, it would weaken their position and create a record of their inability to substantiate their claims. The section on surveying was equally pointed. David's letter noted that no boundary survey had been recorded with the county, as would be required for any survey intended to have legal effect in a property dispute. The letter demanded that the HOA provide the name and license number of the surveyor who had performed their alleged boundary survey, along with a copy of the complete survey report, including the surveyor's certification and the methodology used. Again, this demand put the HOA in a difficult position. If they had hired a legitimate surveyor, that surveyor's work would need to be consistent with the recorded property boundaries and county records, meaning it would contradict the HOA claims. If they hadn't actually hired a licensed surveyor, or if their surveying work was preliminary and non-authoritative, then they had been misrepresenting the strength of their position. but the most impactful section of the letter was the one addressing potential legal consequences for the HOA. David's letter explained that making false claims about property ownership, especially when done in an official capacity with the apparent backing of an organization like an HOA, could constitute several different legal violations. It could be considered slander of title, a specific legal claim that exists when someone knowingly makes false statements that cloud the ownership or marketability of real property. It could be considered harassment or intentional infliction of emotional distress, especially given the threatening tone of the HOA demands and the attempt to impose financial charges for supposed violations. Depending on the HOA motivations and whether they had any financial interest in acquiring the property, it could potentially even constitute attempted theft or fraud. The letter made clear that if the HOA did not immediately retract their claims and cease all attempts to assert control over the property, the title company would pursue legal action to protect the property owner's interests. This could include filing a quiet title action to obtain a court judgment definitively establishing the property boundaries, which would create a public record of the HOA baseless claims and could expose board members to personal liability if they had acted outside the scope of their legitimate authority. The letter also mentioned that depending on how the situation evolved, there could be claims for damages including the cost of legal defense, emotional distress, and any diminution in property value caused by the cloud on the title. The final paragraph of the letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation wrapped in professional language. It noted that the title company assumed the HOA claims had been made due to a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of records rather than intentional fraud, and that the HOA therefore had an opportunity to resolve the matter by promptly retracting their claims and acknowledging their error. However, it also made clear that if the HOA chose to persist in their baseless claims after being presented with clear evidence of their error, such persistence would be viewed as evidence of bad faith and would strengthen any future legal claims for damages or sanctions. It was essentially offering the HOA a face, saving way out while simultaneously making clear that taking that eggs, it was their only reasonable option. David sent the letter via certified mail to Patricia Whitmore at the address listed on the HOA letterhead, with copies to every member of the HOA board whose names and addresses could be identified through county property records and public filings. He also sent copies to the property management company that handled some of the HOA administrative functions and to the HOA registered agent for legal service. This saturation approach ensured that no one involved with the HOA could later claim they didn't know about the title company's response, and it maximized the chances that at least some board members would recognize the seriousness of the situation and push for a retreat from the indefensible position Patricia had staked out. The certified mail tracking showed that the letters were delivered 3 days later. Patricia's letter was signed for by someone at her address in the early afternoon. The copies to other board members were delivered throughout the day, creating a situation where multiple people were simultaneously receiving this detailed legal refutation of the HOA claims. It was easy to imagine the phone calls and text messages that must have started flying among board members as they each opened their letters and realized what had happened. What kind of legal horn its nest Patricia had kicked over in the HOA name? For several days after the letters were delivered, there was silence. The 15-day deadline from the original HOA letter came and went without any follow-up from Patricia or anyone else associated with the HOA. This silence was notable because the original letter had threatened escalating action if there was no response, but now the HOA seemed to have gone quiet. David's letter had included its own deadline, 10 business days to provide supporting documentation, and as that deadline approached, there was some speculation about whether the HOA would try to produce something or would simply let the deadline pass without response. On the 9th business day after the title company's letter had been delivered, an email arrived from the property management company that handled some administrative functions for the HOA. It was addressed to David Brennan, copying the property owner, and its tone was notably different from Patricia Whitmore's original letter. The property manager explained that they had been asked by the HOA board to respond to the title company's letter, and that after reviewing the documentation provided by the title company and conducting their own review of county records, the HOA was withdrawing its claims regarding the property at 1,247 Oakwood Drive. The email stated that there had been a misunderstanding about the location of community property boundaries, and that upon further review, the HOA acknowledged that the disputed section was private property belonging to 1,247 Oakwood Drive with no community interest or easement. The email confirmed that no further action would be taken regarding the property, that the demands made in the original letter were withdrawn, that no payment would be sought for surveying costs or alleged unauthorized use, and that the matter was considered closed from the HOA perspective. The email apologized for any confusion or inconvenience caused by the erroneous claims. Reading this email provided a sense of vindication, but it also raised questions. The complete reversal of position, the sudden acknowledgement that the claims had been wrong, the apology for confusion, all of it suggested that something significant had happened within the HOA. The email came from the property management company rather than from Patricia Whitmore directly, suggesting that perhaps Patricia had been sidelined or overruled. The phrase about a misunderstanding of boundary locations was carefully worded, passive voice construction that avoided placing blame on any specific person while acknowledging the error. David Brennan's response to this email was professionally worded but firm. He acknowledged the HOA retraction of their claims and their acknowledgement that the property boundaries were as shown in the recorded deed. However, his email made clear that a simple retraction was not necessarily the end of the matter. The title company needed to ensure that the cloud on the title was completely cleared, meaning the HOA retraction needed to be documented in a way that would appear in property records and would prevent any future attempts to raise the same claims. David's email outlined several steps the HOA needed to take to properly resolve the matter. First, the retraction needed to be formalized in a written document signed by the HOA president and secretary, explicitly acknowledging that the claims made in the original letter were erroneous and that the HOA recognized the property boundaries as shown in the recorded deed. Second, this document needed to be recorded with the county so that anyone conducting a title search in the future would see the HOA acknowledgement and wouldn't be concerned about potential boundary disputes. Third, the HOA needed to agree in writing not to raise these claims again in the future, essentially stopping themselves from attempting to contest the property boundaries. The email from the property management company also failed to address the question of what documentation the HOA had supposedly relied on in making their original claims. David's email reiterated the demand to see whatever surveys or historical documents the HOA had referenced, noting that understanding the basis for the erroneous claims was important for ensuring that similar mistakes wouldn't happen in the future. This demand served multiple purposes. It kept pressure on the HOA to fully explain themselves. It could potentially reveal if Patricia had simply fabricated the existence of supporting documentation, and it created a paper trail that could be useful if there were ever questions about whether the HOA had acted in bad faith. Several days later, another email arrived from the property management company, this time with attachments. The first attachment was the formal retraction document that David had requested, a one-page letter on HOA letterhead signed by Patricia Whitmore as president and by another board member as secretary. The letter acknowledged that the claims made about community ownership of the eastern section of 1,247 Oakwood Drive were erroneous, confirmed that the HOA recognized the property boundaries as shown in the recorded deed, and stated that the HOA would not pursue these claims in the future. The language was stiff and formal, the absolute minimum necessary to satisfy the title company's demands, but it was signed and notarized and ready to be recorded with the county. The second attachment was more interesting. It was a copy of a preliminary site plan sketch, not a formal survey, that someone had apparently drawn up showing various properties in the neighborhood, including 1,247 Oakwood Drive. The sketch showed some parcels that were marked as common areas, and it appeared that someone had extended one of these common area designations to include part of the eastern section of 1,247 Oakwood Drive. However, the sketch was clearly not an official document. It wasn't drawn by a licensed surveyor, it wasn't based on actual survey measurements, and it wasn't consistent with the recorded property boundaries shown on county maps. It looked like someone had taken a rough map of the neighborhood and had drawn in boundaries where they thought they should be rather than where they actually were. The accompanying email explained that this sketch had been prepared at the request of the HOA president for the purpose of evaluating potential community spaces in the neighborhood. The email carefully avoided stating that this sketch had been the basis for the claims made in the original letter, but the implication was clear. Patricia had commissioned this informal sketch, had interpreted it in a way that supported her desired outcome of claiming part of 1,247 Oakwood Drive as community land, and had then sent her letter based on that interpretation without bothering to verify whether the sketch was actually accurate or consistent with recorded property boundaries. This revelation was somewhat stunning in its implications. Patricia hadn't discovered some forgotten historical document proving community ownership. She hadn't uncovered evidence of surveying errors or boundary mistakes made decades ago. She had simply looked at an informal sketch that someone had drawn up, had decided it showed what she wanted it to show, and had then made bold legal claims based on that wishful interpretation. The reference in her original letter to surveying work and old documentation had been misleading at best, deliberately fraudulent at worst. She had dressed up her baseless claims in official, sounding language to make them seem more legitimate than they actually were. David's response to this revelation was pointed. His email noted that the sketch provided by the HOA was not a survey and had no legal significance, and that making legal claims about property boundaries based on such an informal and inaccurate document was reckless at best. He expressed concern about whether the HOA errors had been the result of negligence and misunderstanding, or whether there had been intentional misrepresentation in the original letter's references to surveying work and documentation. However, he also noted that given the HOA retraction and cooperation in resolving the matter, the title company was willing to consider the issue closed once the retraction document was properly recorded. The recording of the HOA retraction with the county happened within a week. The document became part of the official property records, creating a permanent record that anyone conducting a future title search would discover. This was important not just for protection against the HOA raising these same claims again, but also for protecting the property's value and marketability. Any future buyer conducting due diligence would see the HOA letter in the title company's files, but they would also see the formal retraction and resolution, eliminating any concern about ongoing boundary disputes. With the retraction recorded and the matter officially resolved, attention turned to what had happened within the HOA itself, and whether there would be any consequences for Patricia Whitmore's actions. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had been quiet during the heat of the dispute, suddenly erupted with activity as word spread about what had happened. Several neighbors posted asking for information about why the HOA had retracted claims about community property, with some expressing confusion about what had happened, and others clearly more informed about the details. What emerged from these posts and comments was a picture of internal HOA turmoil. Apparently, when the other board members received copies of the title company's letter and realized what Patricia had done, there had been emergency board meetings and heated discussions about the HOA potential legal liability. Several board members had been unaware of the letter Patricia had sent to 1,247 Oakwood Drive, or had been told it was a routine boundary clarification rather than a serious legal claim against a homeowner's property. When they saw the title company's detailed response, pointing out the fraudulent nature of the claims and the potential for lawsuits. Several board members had been furious. The neighborhood posts included comments from people who claimed to be at or to have heard about these emergency board meetings. According to these accounts, several board members had demanded Patricia's resignation, arguing that she had acted outside her authority and had exposed the HOA to serious legal and financial risk. Other board members had apparently defended Patricia, arguing that she had been trying to advocate for community interests, even if her approach had been flawed. The ultimate resolution seemed to be that Patricia would remain as president, but with significantly reduced authority, with major decisions now requiring full board approval rather than being made unilaterally. One particularly detailed post came from a neighbor who identified themselves as someone who had been at the board meeting where the title company's letter was discussed. According to this account, Patricia had initially tried to dismiss the title company's response as corporate bullying and had advocated for the HOA to continue fighting. She had argued that big title companies use intimidation tactics to protect their corporate interests, and that the HOA shouldn't back down just because they received a strongly worded letter from an attorney. However, other board members had pointed out that the title company's letter included specific references to recorded documents, county records, and property law, none of which the HOA could counter with any legitimate documentation of their own. According to this same account, one board member had specifically asked Patricia to produce the historical documentation and survey results that had been referenced in the original letter to the property owner. When Patricia produced only the informal sketch, the board member had apparently challenged her directly about why she had described this sketch as a survey, and had referenced documentation that didn't actually exist. Patricia's response had been defensive, arguing that she had been acting in good faith based on her understanding of community property boundaries, and that the board should support her rather than attacking her for trying to advocate for community interests. This argument had apparently not gone over well with board members, who were suddenly worried about personal liability if the property owner decided to sue. The decision to have the property management company handle the retraction email, rather than having Patricia send it directly, had apparently been a compromise. Some board members wanted Patricia to personally apologize and take responsibility for the erroneous claims, while others felt that keeping the response professional and having it come from the property management company would be less likely to escalate the situation further. The ultimate decision reflected the board's desire to resolve the matter as quickly and quietly as possible, minimizing the HOA exposure while avoiding internal conflict that could lead to board members resigning. Reading these accounts provided a satisfying sense of how the situation had unfolded behind the scenes, how Patricia's overconfident claims had collapsed when confronted with actual legal scrutiny. But there was also a lingering concern about whether this was truly the end of the matter or whether Patricia, stung by this defeat and apparently still in her position as HOA president, might try to cause problems in other ways. The formal retraction closed off any possibility of the HOA raising the same boundary claims again, but an HOA president with a grudge could potentially find other ways to make life difficult for a homeowner, from aggressive enforcement of minor violations to creating obstacles for any future requests for variance or approval. David Brennan's final email on the matter addressed this concern preemptively. He noted that any future actions by the HOA targeting the property at 1,247 Oakwood Drive could potentially be viewed as retaliation for the owner having successfully defended against the boundary claims. If Patricia or the HOA suddenly started citing violations or imposing fines for minor issues after having left the property alone previously, if they denied reasonable requests that would normally be approved, if they engaged in any pattern of behavior that seemed designed to punish the property owner, such actions could provide grounds for legal claims of harassment. David's email recommended documenting any future interactions with the HOA carefully, keeping records of any communications, and reaching out immediately if there were any concerns about retaliatory behavior. This advice proved prescient within just a few weeks, A notice arrived from the HOA, signed by Patricia Whitmore, citing several alleged violations at 1247 Oakwood Drive. The property's mailbox was supposedly the wrong color, according to the HOA covenants, requiring it to be painted to match the approved scheme. The garden shed in the eastern section, the very shed that had been part of the boundary dispute, was now being cited as not having proper HOA approval for its construction, despite having been built by the previous owner years earlier and having never been an issue before. There was even a citation about the height of grass in a portion of the lawn, claiming it exceeded the maximum allowed height, though this seemed to be based on a momentary condition rather than chronic neglect. These citations were obviously retaliatory, an attempt by Patricia to reassert control and to punish the successful defense against her property claims. Each violation came with a threat of escalating fines, if not corrected within specific timeframes, following the same pattern of intimidation through official-sounding notices that had characterized the original boundary claim letter. But this time, the pattern was obvious, and the documentation of what had happened with the boundary dispute provided clear context for understanding these new citations as harassment rather than legitimate enforcement. A single email to David Brennan with copies of the new violation notices was enough to trigger another round of legal response. Within days, Patricia Whitmore and the HOA board received another letter from the title company's attorney, this time explicitly addressing the appearance of retaliatory harassment. The letter noted the suspicious timing of these citations coming immediately after the boundary dispute resolution, pointed out that several of the cited violations had existed for months or years without any previous enforcement action, and warned that continuing this pattern of targeted enforcement could result in legal action for harassment and retaliation. The letter demanded that all citations against 1247 Oakwood Drive be withdrawn and that the HOA establish in writing that any future enforcement actions would be based on legitimate violations applied consistently across all properties, not selective targeting of one homeowner. The response this time was even faster than before. Within 48 hours, an email arrived from the property management company withdrawing all the violation notices and apologizing for the error. There was no explanation of what error had occurred or why these citations had been issued in the first place. Just a terse withdrawal and an assurance that the matter was closed. But the speed of the response and the complete capitulation suggested that somewhere behind the scenes, other board members had once again reined in Patricia, recognizing that continuing to target this particular property owner was only going to result in more legal problems for the HOA. And with that final withdrawal, the situation truly seemed to be resolved. The property boundaries were confirmed and recorded. The HOA had twice backed down from confrontations when faced with proper legal response, and Patricia Whitmore had presumably learned that making fraudulent property claims and engaging in retaliatory harassment came with consequences. The eastern section of the property remained exactly what it had always been: private land, properly owned, available for gardens and sheds and peaceful enjoyment without interference from an overreaching HOA president who had let ideology and personal preference override property law and common sense. The title company's protection had proven its worth, transforming what could have been a stressful and expensive legal battle into a series of decisive victories that definitively shut down Patricia's attempted land grab. The only question remaining was whether this experience would moderate Patricia's approach to HOA governance going forward, or whether she would continue to push boundaries until she eventually pushed too far and faced consequences more severe than just legal letters and forced retractions.